So, welcome everyone. I am just delighted that you have joined us for today's MTI Research Snaps webinar, Energy Savings and Safety Concerns, the Evolution of Right Turn on Red Policies. My name is Dr. Hilary Nixon, and I am Deputy Executive Director of the Mineta Transportation Institute at San Jose State University. MTI's mission is to increase mobility for all by improving the safety, efficiency, accessibility, and convenience of our nation's transportation system. We accomplish this through surface transportation research, technology transfer, education, and workforce development. MTI currently leads 2 competitively selected multi-university consortia, including the California State University Transportation Consortium, where this research today we were presenting comes from. In today's webinar, we explore research that shows why the standard of right turn on red is not as energy efficient or as safe as we thought. Our speakers today are Dr. Bruce Appleyard and Dr. Anurag Pande. MTI Research Associate and Professor of City and Regional Planning and Public Administration at San Diego State University, Dr. Appleyard is SDSU's Director of the Center for Pedestrian and Bicycle Safety and the Active Transportation Research Center Director. Dr. Appleyard recently authored Livable Streets 2.0 about the conflict, power, and promise of our streets, how to identify problems along streets and at intersections, and how to fix them efficiently and effectively. Dr. Pande is an MTI Research Associate and Professor of Civil Engineering at California Polytechnic State University at San Luis Obispo. Dr. Pande has co-authored more than 30 manuscripts that have been published or are forthcoming in peer-reviewed journals. He also serves as the faculty liaison for community-based learning at Cal Poly. We are recording this webinar, and the link to view will be available shortly on our website and social media pages. Thank you all so much for taking your time to be here today with us, Anurag and Bruce. I turn the floor over to you.
All right. Thank you.
Sorry, I was muted. Thank you so much, Hilary. It's great to be here, and welcome everyone. We're really happy that you're here joining us today. And it's been a great pleasure and honor to conduct this research with Dr. Pande. When we talk about right turn on red, we should look at the Energy Policy and Conservation Act of 1975, which required states to permit right turns on red as mostly as an energy-saving measure. Since then, most states permit right turn on red as a general rule, unless otherwise prohibited at specific intersection by guidance from the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices.
Oh, Bruce, you muted yourself again.
Most states require it unless otherwise posted. Next slide, please. So just sort of the anatomy of the right turn on red collision is often a driver comes up to a red light and is focused on looking left to make the right before they make the right turn, and they fail to yield to a pedestrian or cyclist that's right in the crosswalk. This is one of the more common collisions that occur because of right turn on red policies. Basically, drivers making right turn often look left at oncoming traffic and don't check for the pedestrians and the bicyclists in the crosswalk before turning. And we can look at this as a failure to yield, as a failure to drive with care and empathy for vulnerable road users. Next slide, please. So here's some of the arguments for permitting right turn on reds. According to Lord 2002, right turn on red maneuvers only represent a small proportion of intersection crashes. And also drivers making right turns on red are typically traveling at slower speeds, mitigating injury risk to pedestrians and cyclists. This is from Fleck and Yee. And permitting reduces congestion and improves fuel efficiency according to the Energy Policy and Conservation Act. And we'll actually look at this more closely in our presentation that Dr. Pande gives later after myself. But the collisions, the right turn on red collisions are not insignificant. Over an 11-year period, there are about 10,000 collisions involving pedestrians, 11,000 involving cyclists, and more more even involving vehicles. And fatalities are occurring as well. So it's an average of about 8 a year for pedestrians and 36 over the 11-year period for cyclists. And there's two different types of things we analyzed. We analyzed the TIMS traffic injury mapping system database from UC Berkeley SafeTrek, looking at the right turn at intersections, and also the yield violations according to California Vehicle Code 21453 subsection B. And what's interesting is that 11% of cyclist collisions are preceded by right turns, and only sorry, my Zoom isn't letting me see the number. Only 7% of pedestrians. Please go to the next slide. So arguments for prohibiting right turn on red collisions. It disproportionately affects pedestrians and cyclists, creates an environment that feels less safe, or it erodes the livability of the intersection, even if the actual crash risk could be considered to be low. Recent before and after studies of intersections that have prohibited right turn on red demonstrate a safer environment for vulnerable road users. These were studies conducted in Washington and Seattle. Next slide, please. So throughout our research and mapping all of the right turn on red collisions over the 11-year period, we identified some high risk intersections or high occurrence intersections for collisions. And we found that some of the characteristics with the highest number of right turn on red collisions had no protected cycle lanes, near transit stops, in commercial areas with parking lots, relatively heavy, fast-moving cross traffic, and irregular intersection design that could add to a driver distraction or confusion. So let's see, next slide, please. So this is in City of Los Angeles, Van Nuyen, and Reseda, and you can see a lot of commercial activity. There's bus stops nearby. There's some irregularity to the intersection, so we assume that these are some of the reasons why they're so high in terms of right turn on red collisions, with 6 pedestrian collisions involving right turns over the 11-year period between 2011 and 2022. Next slide, please. Just another view of this intersection to give you a sense. Next slide. This is La Brea and Sunset. Again, an irregular intersection with commercial activity close by, bus stops, and a lot of pedestrian activity, but a lot of cross traffic as well, adding to the distraction. Next slide. This is just another view of that intersection to give you a sense of it. And we also looked at the socioeconomic status of areas where right turn on red collisions were occurring, and we found that there was actually right turn on red collisions were occurring at a higher rate in areas of low socioeconomic status. So each decrease in SES roughly corresponds to the 2.5% increase in the chance of a collision. And so we actually looked at this as well. And so at this point, I'll hand it off to my colleague, Anurag Pande.
Thank you, Bruce. Appreciate it. So some of the relevant guidelines that we use to prohibit right turn on red at this point is the MUTCD guidelines. And what you look for is an acceptable number of pedestrian conflicts. So if you have those, and then if you have pedestrians involving children or older pedestrians or people with disabilities, then you can consider prohibiting right turn on run movement. And now if you look at, so we looked at a memo that was put out by SFMTA, San Francisco Metropolitan Transportation Agency. They noted that even if close calls or blocked crosswalk due to vehicular turns did not always lead to injury crashes, they degraded the walking environment as Bruce had talked about earlier in his presentation. So now they have some evidence of that, where the agencies have put that in writing. Now, the communities that want to promote active travel, it makes sense for them to be able to create a more welcoming environment, because we do want to promote some active travel. And for us to be able to do that, prohibiting right turn on red, not just on individual intersection, but in an area-wide, in an area, might be something that the cities want to do. But right now, the statewide policy being that you're not allowed to prohibit right turn on red at a multiple intersection unless you put specific signs prohibiting them. So if going back to that same SFMTA memo, they pointed out that under California law, right turn on red would continue to remain legal unless adequate signage is provided. And it's just not feasible for the city of San Francisco to provide that signage on over 1,300 traffic signals where they want to ban the right turn on red in an area, right? So that's cross prohibitive for a community that wants to do that. Now, one of the questions that that opponents of prohibiting right turn on red have talked about, and that was in the 1975 federal legislation as well, is that the intersection, if we prohibit right turn on red, vehicle will be idling at a location, and that would basically create more emissions, maybe make use of more fuel. But it's not as clear cut because there are specific factors that determine the emissions impact of right turn on red, and they are intersection geometry, traffic composition and flow, how many vulnerable road users are present, what's the surrounding land use, how good you're enforcing the traffic laws. And then, this is a new one, increased adoption of hybrid and electric vehicle, basically make sure that your emissions are not as great. Like, for example, if you're driving an electric car, they use very low energy when they are parked or when they're stopped, right? And in some cases, what has been found is that if you allow right turn on red, a lot of these right turn on red maneuvers happen with a lot of stop and go movement by the automobiles. And that actually creates more emissions in urban and high traffic environment. And that's basically what the Connecticut DOT also found in their 2024 study. So I think some of the assumptions that we were making before about emissions getting worse, because of right turn on red, that may no longer be valid with the current vehicle mix and the fuel efficiency vehicle mix that we have now. So if you look at the safe systems approach, what we found as Bruce pointed out, and maybe you were thinking to yourself, these numbers of right turn on red collisions, they seem very small, right? So there were 217 fatalities, 39,000 collisions, and over half of these collisions and 134 fatalities involved a pedestrian or a bicyclist and an automobile. And for context, California has about 200,000 reported crashes and 4,000 fatalities. So you might think to yourself, these numbers are modest compared to the overall fatalities. However, I would like you to pay some attention to the key pillar of the safe systems approach, right? Safety is proactive. We should identify and mitigate the latent risk before crashes occur, right? Rather than waiting for crashes to occur, we want to react proactively. So if you look at some relevant data on this, one of the things that's happening with our vehicle fleet based on the buyer's behavior is that if you look at the IIHS study, recent 2022 study, they found that if an automobile, a passenger car strikes a pedestrian or a vulnerable road user while turning right, there is the chance of passenger car killing somebody is much lower than an SUV or a larger pickup truck. So 89% higher chance of a pickup truck killing a pedestrian or a bicyclist when they collide while turning right versus a 63% chance higher for SUVs compared to a passenger car. Now what's happening is at the same time, we have this increased risk of right turn collisions causing fatalities. We also have more and more of these passenger cars becoming, more people preferring SUVs or pickup trucks compared to passenger cars. So now 4 out of 5 cars that are sold in the US are SUVs or pickup trucks, compared to only 50% as recently as 2013. So now the question is, does this show up in the California crash data? And it absolutely does show up in the California crash data. So if you look at the fatality rate of per 1,000 right turn pedestrian collisions, a 3-year moving average, it has doubled from 6.4 in the period from 2012 to 14. From 2020 to 22, it's gone up to 12.9. So it's nearly doubled, or more than doubled. The fatality rate has doubled over this time period, and partly, our higher vehicle mix is to blame. So I think if we get ahead of this problem, we should think about what we are doing to eliminate those conflicts, and right turn on red prohibition may be part of the solution. So, what is the conclusion and potential policy options? One thing I absolutely can say is that if you're considering prohibiting right turn on red is absolutely part of our safe systems approach of taking a proactive approach to safety. Now, one thing that is certain also is that we have to be context sensitive. Anytime we're looking at a safety problem or an operations problem, we have to be context sensitive. But rather than trying to prohibit a right turn on movements on intersection by intersection basis, our recommended approach would be that the law should provide the following options: allow the cities to place blanket bans on right turn on red, and permit them at selected intersection, like what is done in New York City, like what Washington D.C. is trying to do, but they haven't yet done that. But that's one thing that they plan to do. And then City of Seattle is trying, like anytime they put a new traffic signal, they are prohibiting right turn on red. So that could be another sort of approach to take. The other option could be that cities should be able to ban right turn on red at certain select intersections where there are high pedestrian bicyclist density, transit priority areas, new or newly designed intersection. Again, as that's something the city of Seattle is trying to do as well. But here, again, the other context sensitive issue that you have to keep in mind is you can think about this like, for example, if you look at Los Angeles metropolitan area, and there are a lot of contiguous cities, that there, I think, a regional ban might make more sense compared to a citywide ban that might make sense in city of San Francisco, for example, that is relatively isolated from other cities, and so that you can place signs at the entrance of the city. And one last thing I want to say about prohibition: anytime you're trying to think about prohibition, remember that now if you're going to ban right turn on red, there are going to be more right turns will be happening on green. So any prohibition on right turn on red must always accompanied by a leading pedestrian interval, LPI, and that would be a good approach to take as well if you start to prohibit this. Okay, so that's basically a quick wrap of a summary, very, very quick summary of our research. We will be happy to take any questions that you may have submitted already or that may have come in today. Thank you so much for your attention.
Bruce and Anurag, thank you so much for that quick overview of your project. I know we had some questions submitted before the webinar started, as well as some that have come in. So let me jump right in. And it actually ended up being part of a chat that took place during the webinar. And it's asking you to expand a little bit when you talked about lead pedestrian intervals. And if you could tell us a little bit more about your perspective regarding those, do you have suggestions in terms of the best timings? Dan Norris was talking about some examples in the chat in Reading, and I know we had some previous questions that talked about a timing New Jersey DOT uses with a 3 to 5 second lead. So I'm wondering if you could expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, I think that so leading pedestrian interval is basically where you have the walking signal for the pedestrian come up before the green signals for the automobiles come up for the same approach. And that basically has the benefit of pedestrians already being in the crosswalk when the vehicles start to move. And that gives more visibility to the pedestrians and safer for the pedestrians. Now, the challenge of it is that it's very hard to kind of come up with like a universal solution, and that's a broader thing with the transportation solution, right? It's very hard to, everything is context sensitive, and because of that, that depends on how much width the pedestrians are trying to cross, how many pedestrians there are, and LPI has been known to be a safe system intervention even where you don't ban right turn on red, right? So that's basically that's basically the idea, is that but absolutely, if you're going to ban right turn on red, that there is going to be more right turns happening on the green signal. And that's where you absolutely must have some kind of a leading pedestrian interval, because otherwise, you may be putting more pedestrians at risk under those scenarios. I'm not sure if that answers all the questions that were there, but that's my perspective on it.
We'll keep going. Yeah, my guess is this is such an interesting hot topic. We probably won't get to all the questions, but let's see how many we can get through. So there was an interesting, and I know that I've experienced this myself with drivers behind me being, placing pressure on the driver, maybe a little bit of road rage to maybe make some unsafe behaviors with right turn on red. So do you know of any studies, examples of how that has played out in terms of this idea of where we're feeling that pressure to make an unsafe movement because we want to please the person in the car behind us.
Yeah, and that happens in so many different scenarios, right? Sometimes you have a bike lane come up to intersection. If it's a wide enough bike lane, there will be pressure on you to go to the right if you're driving a car. So this happens in a lot of contexts. So there is some, so for example, where right turn on red is prohibited, those types of things are already accepted, right? For example, in New York City, they only allow it on certain intersections, and that works well there. But again, where you are starting from scratch, that always is a challenge. And specifically, if you're going to have some kind of policy where it's blanket ban on multiple intersections without having a specific sign, I think that would be one thing that I would be very wary about in terms of driver having some pressure and some road rage types incidents. But I think probably public outreach will be an idea that you kind of make sure that when you institute these types of bans, I think you do a well-designed education campaigns around that. I think that so that people feel more comfortable knowing the rules, what they are, how they are enforced. And I think in some of these things, I think we can be better off if there were more acceptance of automated enforcement. I think some of the times when we provide these rules, I think if we can sort of have these rules come on with some appropriate enforcement mechanisms, I think that can benefit as well. And Bruce, feel free to chime in as well. Sorry, I took sort of some of the bandwidth here, but feel free to chime in if you have some thoughts on these.
No, thanks, Anurag. One thing I do want to point out is our client for this was California State Assembly staff David Sforza. And so these findings went directly to the state legislature to consider a policy going forward on this. And one of the things we grappled with was how do you actually sensibly implement a policy that wouldn't be confusing or costly. So the idea of having people put signs up at every intersection they're allowing right turn on red could be really cost prohibitive. And so that's why we were thinking that maybe city by city could say we are a right turn on red free zone, and to announce it to people as they come into the city, and then and go forward like with that as an implementation mechanism. So these are some of the things we were grappling with when we were coming up with our policy recommendations.
Yeah, thank you for that. There's a couple of questions in the Q&A that talk about not just pedestrians, but also bicyclists, as well as e-scooters and other micromobility devices. And it's not just those, the incidents where the cyclists and the micromobility would be going the direction of traffic, but also sometimes if they're going the wrong way and there's a counterflow incident. And I'm wondering if your research looked into that specifically in terms of some of the challenges and the specific incidents you looked at, but also how this policy might impact when we think about Vision Zero and how do you create a zero fatality environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we didn't specifically look at people traveling in different directions, although we could. And I think the idea is in addition to it being safer to have a right turn on red ban, it's also more livable. So if we're looking at Vision Zero to lower collisions and fatalities, but also what's more comfortable to vulnerable road users, a right turn on red ban would satisfy that.
Thank you. There was another question actually was asking about right turn on red within work zones. And I know that Caltrans, for example, has had a lot of interest in work zone safety and how do we make sure we're protecting our transportation workers in vulnerable environments. And I'm wondering if any part of your study touched on right turn on red in work zones.
We didn't specifically look at work zones per se in this work. That was not part of the scope of the work that we look at. But I do think these work zones could be as interesting sort of, sort of policy laboratory for us, like a policy lab for us in that, you can probably get some of these enforcement mechanisms, some of these, prohibitions that you otherwise might not be able to sell. You might be able to sell them as sort of protecting the vulnerable and workers and sort of blue collar workers in our communities that are working, and we can maybe the automated speed enforcement is another example of that type of a policy that we can probably phase into it in the work zones, and then see how they perform, and then depending upon how they perform, maybe this could be they could be more widely acceptable because they work in the work zones, they reduce fatalities in the work zones. Maybe they can be then more widely accepted. But specifically in this project, we did not look at the work zone crash data. But I do think that kind of looking at these policies, some of these more controversial policies, and implementing them in special areas like work zones might be a way to kind of make some more policy progress along those lines.
Thank you. Another question I wanted to get to that was submitted earlier on. I think sometimes we're having to deal with stakeholders who might be skeptical. Change can be very hard for us as users of the transportation system. So do you have any examples of municipalities, agencies, projects that very successfully implemented no right turn on red measures when there had been a fair amount of stakeholder skepticism about it?
This is a very tough question because I think it's very few examples of. So actually, we haven't seen that yet, right? I mean, this is something that New York City has already done that this way. So they are fine. It works well there. But Washington, D.C. is trying to implement it, and they're having so many challenges. Again, I don't think this has been attempted at that scale yet, where we can say that, people generally came and turned around. I don't think there is any reason to believe that will not happen or will happen in this scenario, because there are a lot of examples from, for example, the roundabout usage, and there are a lot of things that people are initially very opposed to, but then they come around and figure out, this is something that's making our community safer. So I think this has happened, but I'm not familiar with, anything where the statewide policy or a citywide policy went into effect and that changed people's perspective, because I don't think we have tried that at that scale yet. Because I think, so in Seattle, for example, they've tried that, like at the new intersections, for example, they will have that. And then there are places where they're trying some dynamic signage. Dynamic signage might work in terms of when the pedestrians are present. They have become somewhat more acceptable over time. But I don't think just the time of day type of signage has been very effective from a human factors perspective. So, but again, I don't think we have a lot of evidence one way or the other where this has been implemented and tried. We are just kind of in that way, we are just making some guesses around that. Although it makes sense from a safe systems perspective.
Yeah, I think some of these questions are good for a phase 2 study on this. Anurag, I hope you and I take them on.
Yeah, it's been great. And it's been wonderful. As you mentioned, dynamic signage. Daniel Lai was talking about some dynamic signage that they've tried in Bellevue, Washington. So the combination of your conversation as well as the chat has been great. One of the things I realize we are coming very close to the end of the time. I want to ask one more question, and then I'll wrap us up. And it relates to some technologies and kind of using technology for enforcement methods. And I'm wondering if you've got any examples or studies that have looked at the effectiveness of automated enforcement using technology. Yes.
I mean, a long time ago, I looked at automated enforcement in Northern Virginia, and it was very effective. And what they actually found, and I'm sure there are a lot of other studies out there, so I don't want to give them short shrift. But I remember there was an increase in rear end collisions because when automated enforcement came in, they people would stop when other people would be anticipating them going through the intersection. And I mean, that was a short term. That if as people get used to it, they probably would have happened less. But that was the reason they took away the automated enforcement, because of the rear end collisions that were occurring. So I think though that in this case it could be really effective to do spot automated enforcement on right turn on red.
And one last thing I would say, Hilary, about this increase in rear end crashes, we have to kind of look at it from a safe systems perspective, right? I mean, even if you include some fender bender type crashes, but you're saving lives at the other end, then what's the trade-off there? So just from a safe systems perspective.
Thank you both so much. And I can obviously tell from the chat and from all the questions, this is a really important topic that people have a lot of interest in, and there's a lot of movement in terms of trying out different techniques. So I would encourage all of you, I know we couldn't get to every question, but please reach out to our researchers. I know that they have been generous with their time, and I'm sure they will continue to be generous with their time. So the final report is available on our MTI website if you want to take a closer look. We'll put a link into the chat. And then just one last note before we go. Please join us next Friday, May 16th, 10 a.m. Pacific time. We have an event called Beyond the Stadium, Keeping Cities Moving During Mega Events. California is gearing up for an extraordinary lineup of global sporting events. We've got Super Bowl 60, 2026 FIFA World Cup in the Bay Area, and of course the 2028 Olympics in Los Angeles. So this event is going to explore how transit systems and their workers can safely and sustainably move these crowds while minimizing community and environmental impacts. And the link to register has been dropped into the chat. Thank you all so very much for spending 30 minutes of your day with us. We really appreciate it.